The thing that got me was the noise. The voices shouting and cursing and pleading. The doors banging closed. The snap of locks being turned. Up until then, I had been the big man, all bluster and face and a sneer like I didn't care. But lying there, hearing that noise, I started to cry. I was 18 years old and it was my first night in a prison cell. I thought about a lot of things that night. How my mother's heart was broken when the police came to arrest me. The few memories that I had of the father who had slipped out of my life when I was 8 years old. The thing that I had stolen and sold for quick and easy cash. Money that I had then burnt on stupid things. I didn't sleep at all, and when the lights went on in the morning, I told myself that when I had served my sentence, I was going to make changes to my life. I would get clean, I would go to college. I would beg forgiveness from my mother and be back in my family home. There was no way I was going back to prison. I could not have been more wrong. 40 years later, I was lying in a bunk in a prison cell waiting for the lights to come on. The sounds of men crying out in their sleep echoed around me. This was my 20th conviction. There is no 3 strikes and you're outlaw in England. I don't know whether that was lucky for me or not, and it was the 8th prison that I had been in. I had moved a lot to all different parts of the country since my first spell in prison, telling myself again and again that this time it was going to be different, that this was going to be the fresh start that I needed. But I always ended up in the same place, inside. I was a loser and I was staring down the barrel of old age. I had wasted my life. The lights flickered into action. The whitewashed walls of these cells stared back at me. I lay there blinking and grimacing. My body was a wreck. No exercise, too many fights, junk food and alcohol when I could get it. It had taken a toll. The hour after hour spent in cramped cells had not helped. I was not the type of prisoner who spent their time doing sit-ups and push-ups. I doubted that I could even touch my toes. If I had been a car, I would have been scrapped, or just abandoned by the side of the road. My back ached, my arms ached, my neck, my guts, and my ankles all ached. After a moment, my head joined in too. Sitting up would only make this worse, but I did it anyway. And then my door unlocked with a sharp groan of its own. Another day in prison had begun. I stepped out onto a walkway. Its iron was hard and cold beneath my feet, and everywhere that I looked I saw dark metal and dirty gray stone. And washed out men like me. The prison I was serving my latest stretch of 5 years in was more than 140 years old. In places, it looked more like a castle than a prison. There were turrets and slits in the outside walls rather than windows. It was overcrowded and filthy and damp. It was lousy that it was still being used to incarcerate men in 2022, but building new prisons cost money, so this place was kept patched up and running. I remember reading an article somewhere that in America running prisons was a big business, with private companies raking in the cash via specially built supermax facilities. Here in England, the authorities were dragging their heels and making do with the dumps that they had like this. I scowled, as my senses were assaulted by the smell of stale sweat from hundreds of men blended with the mold growing on the inside of the walls. And then I joined a line of inmates being shepherded down a metal staircase by prison guards. The guards in this prison were the same as all the others that I had encountered over the years. Some believed that they were helping make the world a better place. Some were bullies and some were bland. These last types of guards worked in a prison, but it might as well have been a factory or a call center. They turned up, they went through the motions, and then they went home, and at the end of the month, they collected their meager wage. That was my theory anyway. The guard with a clipboard standing at the bottom of the stairs was one of the bland types. He looked at me like I was a box in a conveyor belt and said in a monotone voice, "Garden duties for you today, 5674. That was my serial number. I doubted that he even knew my name. I didn't take it personally. I was actually quite pleased. I was not considered high risk, so I was allowed privileges. This meant that I did shifts in the prison's workshop, where the inmates made tote bags and greeting cards, which were sold commercially. I also got to work in the prison garden. Another guard unlocked a barred gate and walked me down a corridor, and then with a different key opened up the door that led out to the prison garden. There were no electronic locking systems in this past-its-sell-by-date prison. I emerged into the fresh air with a smile on my face, and then I shivered violently. The prison stood in the middle of moorland, a rugged, bleak landscape most famous as the setting for the fictional pursuit of a mysterious dog by a certain pipe-smoking detective. It was cold and wet at the best of times, and in late November, the wind felt like it was biting into my skin. Prisoners can't be choosers, though, and it was better than being stuck inside. I wandered over to join the small group of inmates already hard at work, digging and weeding, supervised by a couple of prison guards. I recognized one of the inmates. Brendan was 23 and doing 8 months for stealing a police van and crashing it into a police station. He was in the thick of the gardening action, attacking the root of a plant with a blunt plastic trowel. Another one of my theories is that there are 2 categories of prisoner. The first type say as little as possible, and grunting is preferable to actually forming words. The second type are talkers. Brendan was a talker. He kept nothing bottled up inside. The minute that he saw me, he came over and said, "This place is the pits. My girlfriend smuggled in a mobile for me last week, but the reception is lousy because we're in the middle of nowhere. 1 bar if I'm lucky most of the time, but I get nothing." I glanced around at the guards. Luckily, none of them had overheard. I turned back to Brendan. "You need to be careful," I whispered. "You could have your sentence extended if the guards find out that you have a phone." He nodded and tapped the side of his nose. Subtle as a brick, I thought, and picked up a blunt plastic shovel that was resting against the wall. The garden implements were made by the same people that made the cutlery. There was nothing that could be used as a weapon. The prison garden was in an open square in the center of the prison, and it was a ramshackle affair. Root vegetables seemed to grow okay, and they were cooked in the prison kitchen and served to the inmates. I leaned on the shovel. I had no intention of digging, not with my back, neck, and the rest. Brendan had stopped broadcasting that he had done something dubious, and he was talking to me again. "You know what one of the other prisoners told me? He said that you're growing vegetables in a grave. You see, they used to hang men here 100 years or more ago, and hanged men couldn't be buried in a consecrated ground, so they dug a hole below the gallows, and when the poor prisoner had stopped kicking and twitching, they cut the noose and he fell right in. Then they shoveled the soil back over him. It makes my skin crawl, it does, just thinking about it. All those bones under my feet." There are lots of stories in prisons. I dismissed most of them as urban legends, gruesome gossip to pass the time. I had heard this one before, and I patted Brendan on the shoulder and said, "Don't believe everything you're told, especially not in here." And then I shivered some more. The temperature was not only dipping, but it was hurling itself off a cliff, and dark clouds were gathering. They seemed heavy with the promise of rain and worse. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, the storm broke. Rain began to pelt us, and a bolt of lightning split the sky. The thunder followed seconds later. We ran for the door, scrambled through it, and then stood there gasping. We were soaked to the skin. Brendan looked at me and said, "This storm is epic." And he wasn't wrong. As the guards escorted us back to our cells, I could hear the wind and the rain battering against the walls of the prison. Even the thick old stones couldn't keep the sound out, and every few minutes, thunder filled the air. It sounded like the world was breaking apart. I assumed that the lightning was continuing outside. There were no windows where I was, just the glow of these strip lamps that ran high above us and were embedded into the ceiling of each cell. As the door to my cell was locked, they started to flicker on and off. Around me, men I could not see started to cheer and whistle and stamp their feet. Any disruption was like nectar to the prisoners, and they roared their approval as the thunder and the rain and the wind grew louder and louder, and then the lights went off and stayed off. I sat in my bunk in the darkness and simply listened, a small man at the eye of a storm. The storm lasted for the rest of the morning. Just after noon, it ended as quickly as it had begun and the power came back on. An uneasy silence had settled over the prison, and I could hear the footsteps of a guard near my cell. The lock turned and the door opened. The guard who stood there was one of the making the world a better place type. He had even once told me his first name, James, as he thought that we were going to bond, and I would share the details of my troubled life with him, and that would set me on the path to rehabilitation. Dream on was my view on that. At that moment in time, he looked like he was in pain. "Stupid static," he muttered to himself. I had no idea what he was talking about until my hand brushed a metal rail, and a spark flew from it and struck my fingers. I swore at the sudden stinging pain, and then I put my hands in my pockets and was very careful not to touch anything else. As the guard led me back down the stairs, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and my skin was tingling in places. It was the weirdest feeling. It was like there was a charge in the air. The guard led me out into the prison garden and told me to gather up the equipment. The trowels and spades and the rest lay on the ground where they had been abandoned, ground that was now a muddy wasteland. Just great, I thought. And then I heard a familiar voice behind me. That storm was beyond epic. It was veering on the apocalyptic, Brendan said as he appeared at my side, grinning. I mean, that was so good. It was wall-to-wall storm action. It was one big SOB of a storm, I said, and it's left an almighty mess. Brendan looked at the sodden earth and said in a quiet voice, "Wow." And then he started retrieving the equipment. He didn't seem to care that he was getting mud all over himself. I reluctantly decided that I should help him, and I was wondering where to start when Brendan yelped out in pain. There was no metal in sight, so it can't have been static again, I figured. His left hand was curled up and he was holding it against his chest. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Something bit me," he gasped. I looked down at the ground and could see a big bug crawling away. It was one ugly mother and seemed strangely unsteady on its many legs. I stomped on it with my boot. Its carapace was harder under my sole than it did not give. I put all my weight into it and eventually I felt a crack. And then I spent some time wiping my boot clean on the ground. I didn't want to look at the messy remains and I turned my attention back to Brendan. He was still hugging his hand against himself and pulling a face. "You'll be okay," I told him, and together we quickly collected up the equipment and then were led back to the door. Just in time too, because the rain started to fall once more and the first crack of thunder sounded like an echo to the door being slammed shut. I was taken back to my cell. I didn't think anything more about Brendan being bitten until a guard came to collect me from my cell a short while after. As he led me along a walkway, I could hear the storm still raging outside. The wind sounded like it was trying to rip the prison building from the face of the earth, and as the thunder growled and the rain struck. 10 minutes later, we reached the prison infirmary. The prison's doctor was waiting for me. He was a tough-looking ex-soldier who I had heard had served all over the world. I thought of him as one of the good guys. I had seen him for a few ailments over the time that I had been in this prison, and I always found him thoughtful and kind. Concern clouded his expression when he spoke. Brendan is running a temperature and I'm concerned he has picked up a viral infection, but the symptoms are not ones that I have seen before in all my travels. I'm going to make a call to put in a request to have him moved to a hospital. In the meantime, I think it would be helpful for Brendan to have a friend by his bedside. Is that something that you're okay with? I nodded. Sure, I said. I carried a plastic chair over to Brendan's bedside. The guard who had brought me was slouched against a wall, close to where the doctor was now sitting at a desk with a PC and a landline phone on. Brendan was in a very bad way. His eyes were screwed shut. He was very pale and coated in sweat and muttering to himself and turning this way and that. One of his wrists was held by a restraint that was anchored to the frame of the bed. This was standard procedure but struck me as cruel than the extreme of that moment. I said, "Hey Brendan, hang on in there." And the lights went out again. They lasted longer in the storm this time, but with the ancient systems in this prison, they were bound to give sooner or later. In the sudden darkness, I could hear the doctor saying, "Hello, can you hear me? Come on." It sounded like the phone line had gone out as well. And then the lights came back on, to an extent. They were much weaker than before and cast a dull yellow glow over everything. "That's the backup generator we have for the infirmary," the doctor said, but I wasn't really listening. During the brief blackout, Brendan had stopped moving. He looked to me like he had died. I felt choked up and I was about to say something to the doctor when Brendan's eyes opened. His head turned to one side and he looked at me. The fear trickled through me, ice cold and razor sharp. His eyes were filled with hate and madness. I felt like I was looking into the eyes of some primal creature, of some monster. "Doctor," I said weakly. He got to his feet and started walking over to Brendan and me. "Hurry," I said. Brandon was twisting and shaking his body and clawing at the air with his free hand, and struggling violently to free his restrained hand. He pulled it and pushed and rattled his wrist, trying to escape, but the restraint held. And then Brendan leaned over and began to bite into his own arm just below the restraint. Sickening sounds of tearing and crackling filled with the infirmary, and then he was pulling his arm free, leaving behind his hand. He had chewed through his own arm. He sat up, span around. The doctor stood staring in horror at him. Brendan got to his feet, the ragged bony stump of one of his arms hanging loose at his side, dripping blood onto the floor, the other arm reaching out. He looked at me for a moment and then turned away and began to stagger slowly towards the doctor. The guard, who was still somewhere on the other side of the room, began to scream. The doctor opened his mouth but was silent and still. He looked paralyzed by fear. Brendan draped his good arm over the doctor's shoulder and leaned in. I did not see him bite, but I saw the agony on the doctor's face. I watched as the doctor's legs crumpled and he fell to his knees. His face was hideously disfigured. Blood-soaked muscle and bone shimmered in the emergency generator's yellow light. He looked at me, appealing for help with his eyes. I looked away from his grotesque gaze. What could I do except cower in terror as the nightmare continued? Brendan had cornered the prison guard and held the struggling man pinned against the wall. Brendan was tearing him apart. Red splattered over every surface. The doctor, abandoned, was convulsing as he went into shock, and moments later he stopped moving. The guard was no longer struggling either. The only movement was Brendan feeding. I got to my feet. My legs felt drained all of strength, and I was shaking badly, but I knew I had to get out of there while Brendan's attention was on sating his abhorrent hunger on the guard. I did not know why Brendan hadn't attacked me. Was it, I wondered as I inched towards the door, because we used to be friends? Did a vestige of the young man that I had known remain inside this murderous freak? I made it out onto a walkway. The rest of the prisoners seemed to be locked in their cells, and I could only make out one guard through the gloom which had shrouded everything. And the guard was heading my way. It was James. He was clearly oblivious to what had happened in the infirmary. I stumbled towards him. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Why are you not being supervised?" he asked. "Brendan, he's killed them." "What the?" James began. I talked over him. "Brendan has changed. He's a monster. You have to get help." James' expression spoke volumes. He thought that I had lost it. "No, you have to believe me," I begged, "before it's too late." Only it already was. Brendan was staggering towards us. He wore a mask of his victim's blood, and once again he passed me by and closed on James. James would be dead in moments, unless I acted. There was an unoccupied cell a few feet away. Its door was open and the smell of bleach was strong. It was washed out and ready for its next occupant. "Move towards the open cell," I yelled at James. "Trust me, do it now." He stumbled backwards and towards the cell, and Brendan followed. James was almost through the door when I shouted, "Jump to one side." He leaned to his right and I barreled into Brendan using all my weight. He fell into the cell, I did not, and I slammed the door shut. "Block it!" I screamed at James. He looked utterly lost and confused and terrified, but he did it and then stood there shaking. And then he leaned over and looked like he was going to vomit. "We don't have time for that," I told him. "There are 2 people that he attacked in the infirmary, and I've seen enough horror movies to know that they'll be back on their feet in no time and coming for us." "I can't deal with this," James said. "Infirmary door locked now. Hysteria later," I replied. Looking very green, he hurried over to the infirmary door and secured it. By this time, more guards had appeared, and they demanded to know what was going on, which was fair enough. Brendan was groaning and hammering on the door of the cell that we had trapped him in. The blood that he had trailed all over the floor was a line of darkness in the gloom. And now there was more groaning coming from behind the locked infirmary door. I looked at the guards and looked at James and said, "I really need some fresh air." "No way," one of the guards snapped back. "You should be in a cell." James held up a hand. "This man saved my life," he said. "I'll take him out into the prison garden. In the meantime, I suggest you rustle up an armed response unit and some people in biohazard suits. There's an unholy mess that needs cleaning up." As the guards looked at us open-mouthed, James led me away. He unlocked the door and followed me out into the prison garden. The storm had ended. The air was clear. I stood there breathing it in, and relief flooded through me. It was over, and I was safe. And then I noticed there was a strange smell coming from the ground. The smell of decay. The smell of death. It rose from the mud and it was growing in strength. 2 more guards emerged. As the stench hit them, they covered their mouths and noses with their hands and swore. James looked disgusted. He was standing in the middle of the garden and started to walk back towards the door, clearly wanting to get away from the smell. But he had only taken a couple of smells when the insects began to emerge. They scurried up out of the ground, dozens of them at first. Many of them were like the bug that had bitten Brendan. But there were spiders as well, and they were all rushing out into the open and over James' shoes. More and more insects were joining them. There were hundreds by then, and they were rapidly crawling up him. I could no longer even see his shoes for the layer of bugs, and they had started to make their way up his trousers. He tried to kick them off, tried to sweep them off with his hands, but instead of falling away, the insects scurried onto his hands. They ran up his chest, his back, and they had reached his neck. And it was then that I saw the blood, the red beneath the growing layer of insects, and I realized with horror that the insects were biting him. He began to cry out in pain and tried to move towards the door, towards what I guessed he thought was safety. But there were too many insects on him. They covered his face and his hair, and soon, the only thing of him that I could see was his blood dripping between the moving swarm of insects as they overwhelmed him. Only minutes after the attack began, he fell to the ground. I had been transfixed by the revolting spectacle, but felt someone pulling at me and turned. It was one of the guards. "We need to get back indoors now," he said, his voice shaking with terror. I did not need telling twice. As soon as we were back indoors, the door was slammed shut and locked, leaving James to his own gruesome fate. I took a deep breath. I looked at the guards and then said, "I would like to go back to my cell now." That was 6 months ago. I'm at an internet cafe now, writing this all out. The coffee that I had bought has since gone cold, and in a while I'll be heading back to the hostel where I'm staying. I'm a free man again, and this time I mean it when I say that I am not going back inside that prison. I've wasted my entire life in prisons, and I almost died in one of them too. In the aftermath of the incident, I was taken into a room and told by a man in a uniform that a statement was being issued. The statement said that there had been a riot at the prison, and that, tragically, there had been many fatalities. It was a cover-up, pure and simple. I was also told that if I ever said anything about what had really happened to anyone in the prison or once that I was released, I would be in the worst trouble of my life. Well, that's a risk that I'm prepared to take. The truth needs to be known by everyone. A warning needs to be given. I saw an innocent man twisted into a fiend by forces that I have struggled to comprehend. In the many sleepless nights that had followed the incident, I have thought long and hard about what had happened, and I have the scrap of a theory. Now call me crazy if you want, but this is what I believe happened. The hanged men who were buried long ago beneath the ground that became the prison garden had rotted, as dead men often do, but something of them had lingered. Their desire for retribution against a world that had condemned them to be killed, and their bodies treated like waste. Their hatred which burned inside them as the noose had embraced their necks. These were so strong they did not die with them. They lay dormant until the storms awoke them. Their rage then was back from the dead, and it infected the land and the bugs. The one that had bit Brendan turned him into a zombie, the most hideous creature that has ever walked this earth. I don't know where he's been taken to, some top secret lab maybe where the nightmare continues. And not just for him. There are so many obscenely cruel injustices that have been committed over the years in the name of justice that I see no reason why this should not happen again in some other place or time. Only next time it will be worse, because I truly believe there are unknown horrors waiting out there that no prison can contain.